In this video, I want to share with you how to stretch your watercolor paper and why you would want to stretch it. There's a lot of artists that don't stretch their paper at all. They'll just staple it down onto a board, some type of a foam core board or a plywood, and then they'll paint. But there's others that like to have it stretch and taunt. The reason I like to stretch mine is because when I watercolor and I've got a lot of water on my paper, I don't like the way the paper will curl up and I'll get hills and valleys and my water will run into these little valleys and create these hard areas. So I like to stretch all my papers and I just make it a rule of habit. There's different ways that you can stretch it, but this is the simplest way that I have found. First of all, you're going to need a foam core board. And it's just a piece of board that has a foam in it. And it can be also called gator board, or it's just a very sturdy watercolor mounting board. So you'll need one of those. And then you're going to need your watercolor paper. Now what I usually do is I draw my picture on my watercolor paper before I even get started. And oftentimes I'll trace it on there because I've drawn it on my drawing paper and I'll just trace it onto my watercolor paper. So I want to do that before I stretch. Most of the time that's the way I do it. And what I want to do is make sure my lines aren't any darker than I want them to be when I'm ready to start painting. I'm going to leave this dark because I want to be able to demo it and be able to have you see it on the camera. But usually I'll take a kneaded eraser and I'll lift my lines out so there's not a lot showing. It's not too dark before I stretch it. And the reason I do that is because once you put your paper into the water, it makes the pencil lines go, they tend to get almost a permanent feel and you can't lift them out. So that's why I do that. Usually when I stretch my watercolor paper, I'll actually just go up to the kitchen sink and I'll turn the water on and I'll run the faucet, run my paper underneath the faucet, and I'll just tip it and turn it. And little by little, it'll get kind of soggy. It just kind of goes a little limper than what it is now. Then I'll flip it over and I'll do both sides. As soon as I get done, I'll pick it up and hold it from a corner and drain it, and I'll show you how to do that. Now, if you might wonder if you need to use hot or cold water, I just use a room temperature water. So it doesn't have to be hot or cold, just a lukewarm or a room temperature water. So what I've done for this video is I've just filled this bin up with water. And I've just got enough water in there that I can soak my watercolor paper. Now, this is a smaller picture. If you're doing something bigger, you might have to use a big sink, you might have to use a bathtub, something like that, but just make sure that you don't have any oils or soaps in whatever container that you're soaking your watercolor paper in. I'm using Arches 140-pound paper. If you're using something heavier, like a 300-pound paper, you really don't need to stretch it. You just staple it onto your board and you're ready to paint. But the 140-pound paper is a little more reasonable in price, and it's what most people use. So I suggest you use Arches. It has a cotton fiber in it, so if you put a regular piece of paper in water, it would just fall apart. But this has got cotton fibers that will hold it together, and it's meant to get wet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bin, I'm filling it up with water, and I've got it ready to go. And I'm going to take my paper, I'm going to put it in the water, and I basically am going to just push it down, and I'm going to try to make sure it's all covered. And what I want to do is I want it to just let it sit there for a good 60 seconds, and I'm just going to make sure it stays wet. And it takes a little while for the water to soak through that paper and to grab those cotton fibers and get them moist. So I'm just kind of tapping it down, and I'm going to let it sit there. So once it's sat there for about 60 seconds, then I'll be ready to move on. So I'm just letting it get nice and wet. And like I say, if you're running it underwater, do the same thing. Just let the water run on it for about the same amount of time. And when I feel it, can you see how it's a little more bendable than it was? I just kind of wait so it feels like it's pliable, so that I can wrap it without it's not going to bend on me, but it's kind of got a soft, pliable feel to it. And then as soon as I feel like I'm to that point, that's when I take it out and I move on. Now, if for some reason you get sidetracked and you want to let it soak longer, it's not a big deal. You can let it soak for quite a while. I know people that let it soak for 5, 10, and 15 minutes before they pull theirs out, so it's not a big deal. But I don't let it soak for a long time just because I feel like this is sufficient. And then now that I'm ready to get it on the board, I'm going to lift it up from a corner, and then I'm just going to hang it from this corner and let the drip dissipate a little bit. And then once it's done, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and pick up my paper, and I'm going to lay it flat. I'm going to put my paper flat on this board. And then I'm just using a regular stapler. I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to just staple one corner in, and then I'm going to grab the opposite corner, and I'm going to pull it as taut as I can. And then I'm going to staple that corner, and then I'll go to the other two corners. So when I pull it and stretch it, I want to stretch it both this direction and this direction so it doesn't buckle. So I'm going to go ahead and do the last corner here, and I'm making sure I stretch it tight. Because of the cotton fibers in it, it doesn't tear easily at all. And then I want to put a staple about every 2 to 3 inches all the way around. And I try not to go too far in. I try to stay close to the edge, but not right on the edge of the paper, just so it has some strength there. And I'm going to work my way all the way around to get that stapled. Okay, so now what you can do is you can just let it sit overnight and dry, or you can use a blow dryer. I oftentimes will just use a blow dryer to get it dry before I work on it. And what this does is once it dries, it makes your paper taut, and so it's nice and tight. And when you add watercolor to it, it doesn't wrinkle up on you. So one thing to keep in mind when you're ready to start painting, if you use a blow dryer and you're blow drying it, if you think it's dry and it kind of feels dry but you're not quite sure, if it's cool in temperature, that means that there's still some moisture under the paper and in the paper fibers that aren't all the way dry. So if you feel it and you touch it and it feels cool, it actually isn't dry all the way. So make sure it's dry all the way before you get started. I hope this helps. Stretching your paper is just a great practice, making sure that you have it nice and taut and ready to go, so when you start painting, you don't have any problems of water running into little hills and valleys that you don't want to be there. Hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time.